Hi, I'm Melissa Bill, and welcome to the Business Roundup, where we catch up with the movers and shakers in the business world. Today, joining me is Jennifer Good. She's the co-founder, president, and CEO of Trevi Therapeutics. Thank you for joining me today.
Yeah, thank you for having me.
So, in the world of healthcare and research, we've definitely come a long way, but we probably have a long way to go. There's things that we're learning and uncovering, and there's conditions that are coming up that probably weren't as prevalent before. How did you can you give us a little bit about your background and what got you interested in the industry?
Yeah, so my background's actually accounting and finance. So I started off my career working as a CPA at Ernst& Young, the accounting firm. And the value of that was I had a lot of different clients that ranged from huge banks to little tiny startups. And I worked there for 7 years. And what I was able to sort of tease out by doing that work is that I was definitely more drawn to innovative, sort of risk-taking, problem-solving businesses as opposed to big banks, big utilities, big companies, those kinds of things. So early in my career, I sorted out that I definitely liked the whole innovative path. So I'd started working in high-tech biotech back then. I then had an opportunity sort of in my journey to end up in the sort of broadly biotech space and grew up. And I think I always was interested. I didn't have a medical or science background, but solving unmet needs in healthcare, I think most of us are drawn to that. You meet these patients with their stories. And I think this ability to do something with your career that really helps change the lives of people was just such an amazing opportunity. And I realized that you don't have to be a doctor or scientist to do that. This industry is complex and it requires all different skill sets. So I think sort of figuring out I like that innovative side and then figuring out that I really appreciated sort of the contributions that biotech healthcare generally can make to society is important.
And now, when you had that, what was the initial spark of observation that led you to founding Trevi Therapeutics? What was it that kind of drew you to that?
Yeah. So I don't know that there's ever a certain moment. I was at a prior to this, and you'll hear me sort of refer to this. My co-founder is a guy named Dr. Tom Shasha. He's a neurologist by background. As I mentioned, I was the CFO at a company called Penn West and eventually became CEO. So I was always sort of the business money side of things, and Tom was always sort of, I joke, the brains behind the operations. We were working actually in the field of chronic pain in sort of the 90s and 2000s. And you could see this whole crisis coming with opioid addiction. And I was always very conflicted because that was obviously a huge public health care crisis. At the same time, we would meet these patients who were living with chronic pain in their lives that was completely debilitating. They had to leave their jobs. It was difficult to parent, just all that stuff. And so while we were there, Tom and I started thinking about ways to sort of think about pain that didn't involve addictive opioids. And we'd started working on this drug, actually, Haduvio, back in that company. That company ultimately was acquired for our lead asset, which got approved in pain. And this drug we had gotten interested in that was not scheduled, so it wasn't an addictive opioid, was going to get sort of lost in the sauce, if you will, in the acquisition. So when that acquisition closed in 2010, Tom called me and said, I would really like to finish our work with that drug. I've got all these ideas and we can talk more about that linkage. But that was sort of the moment. I had sort of this moment in time where I was on a severance package from an acquisition. We had access to this compound. I was close to the company that bought it. So I had access to go negotiate it out and had some time on our hands. So we decided to see if we could put this together into some viable business and get it funded and try to pursue some of the things Tom was interested in. So it was sort of a lining of events that happened. And I think being willing to take a risk there, because it's not easy when you've just lost a job you've been in for 16 years to say, all right, I'm going to go do this, not get paid, and take a chance it'll ever turn into something. But that was sort of the moment where we're like, all right, let's see if we can make this happen. We'll put it on a clock, and if we don't get there, we don't get there.
But you saw that need too that it could address, and that's another thing too. How can it help people?
Yep. And kudos to Tom. He gets a lot of credit for that. There's this link that goes on, and this is very understandable even because I understood it, but there's always been this belief that pain, cough, and itch are all interrelated. Itch is the skin's version of pain. Cough is the lungs version of pain. And so this drug that we were working on was originally a pain drug, but Tom had been thinking about the biology and how much it intersected with these neurological cough conditions and these neurological itch conditions, which had no treatment. So all this work had been done in pain, but nobody had done any work in these other conditions. And that was the bridge he was trying to build.
And now, how did you identify Haduvio as a promising compound for the chronic cough, particularly given its prior applications? Like, how did they kind of narrow that down?
Yeah. So, um, Haduvio is broadly in the opioid categories I've alluded to, but it's not what's called a mu agonist. So when people think about things like fentanyl or morphine or Oxycontin, things that are being abused, those are all mu agonists, and that's where addiction comes from. This drug actually is active at the kappa receptor, which is another receptor in the opioid chain that doesn't have all the likability that goes with it. And it actually has a dual receptor that blocks that mu receptor. So it's why the drug wasn't scheduled. Now, interestingly, and this is what a lot of people don't understand, the body is loaded with endogenous opioid receptors. It's why opioids are so effective in the body, because you have endogenous opioid receptors all through your body. It's part of evolution. And it's why you get such big effects in the brain, sort of in different parts of the body. And so the link to cough really was the lung, the spinal cord, which is your signaling transmission in the brain, are all rich. They call it the cough reflex arc in this opioid pathway. The problem is you don't want to be giving everyone these Schedule II opioids, although we all know things like codeine is one of the only things, codeine cough syrups, that's an opioid. Those work in cough. Low dose morphine works in cough. The problem is they have a lot of baggage associated with them. And so we were interested in taking our compound that didn't have all that baggage associated with it to see if you could get a better solution in cough. So that was kind of the link that we were chasing.
Something that would be a little bit less, habit forming and just a little bit
Yeah, I
safer.
mean, no habit forming. It's unscheduled. The DEA knows this compound. So yeah, no, I was not interested in wading into that mess for sure.
Now, who were the key individuals? I know you mentioned one involved in the founding of Trevi, and what like a unique expertise did they bring?
Yeah, so it started off just Tom and I at our kitchen table. I had my kids answering the phones, classic startup story. That we then, because Tom and I had worked together in a prior company, we had about 100 people there who had all gone off into jobs, but we're keeping track of what we were doing. So we started pulling in people part-time to help us. And some of these people were working for stock options, trying to get questions answered. So we sort of went from the two of us to adding a finance person to doing some marketing work. And there were sort of jumps in time, I remember, where we went from 2 to 7 of us and we got a little office space to sort of 12. And then you kind of built your way along. Now we still only have about 35 people. So we're not that big a company, even though we're sort of $800 or $900 million market cap. So it's amazing how much you can do with the right people. But yeah, I would
Right.
say Tom and I were the two sort of early founders, risk takers. And then we just started adding on skill sets as we needed them and mostly drew up on people that we had worked with in our careers.
Now, what along the way, what were some of the challenges of building a biopharmaceutical company from scratch?
I mean, financing in biotech is always the number one challenge, which is why people always say, what's a finance person doing running a biotech company? Well, that's why a finance person runs a biotech company. I mean, you start off, first of all, you're individually funding it, and then you go to angel investors. Then we did 3 rounds of venture. You got to IPO the company, and now we're doing follow-ons. We just raised 115 million like 3 weeks ago. So it's just this constant sort of survive in advance. You get good data, you raise the next round. So that's definitely a challenge. If somebody doesn't know how to do that, I mean, I get calls all the time from people trying to start companies. If you don't know sort of how to do that journey, even if you know, it's very hard. It's very difficult now in early stages to get funding. I would say the other hard part was creating a succinct vision about how you were going to drive value and how you get to the next inflection point. And I think sometimes founders are looking for investors to tell them what they want to fund, but you have to go in as a founder with conviction around what you're doing and lay out a really clear path of here's the questions we're going to try to answer and here's how we're going to drive value. And that's hard to do because you basically don't know anything. You don't know if you get a patent, you don't know the market because a lot of these markets aren't formed. You don't know what the FDA is going to say. There's just so many things you don't know, but you have to try to put together that business plan. So I would say that was challenging. And then the question you led with, which is, it's always about building the right team, sort of, and when you build that team. You can't bring on too many people early because you run out of money before you answer questions. At the same time, you can only do so much when you have just 2 or 3 people and certain skill sets. So I would say money, sort of creating that succinct vision that gets you to the next value inflection point, and knowing when to bring on the right people and what skill sets you need. I would say those were sort of the early day challenges.
And looking back on it, what are some of the most significant lessons learned about building and growing it?
Yeah, I would say looking back, one, I think it's always good to be an eternal optimist, practical eternal optimist, but you have to really believe in what you're doing and be ready to, I mean, you get knocked down like 500 times and you've got to be like, okay, but I learned something from that and you got to keep going. So that's one side of it. You do definitely have a spirit of, okay, perseverance here. But the other side of it is, I think, you got to be willing to adapt your strategy. And for instance, Trevi, good example, we were actually pursuing 2 paths at the same time. We were looking at pruritus, which is a fancy word for severe itching, and cough. And we sort of came to the end of 2022 and had good data in both those conditions. We could have progressed both of them. But we made the decision as a small company, it's expensive to move these indications along. And the pruritus side of things, which actually was our lead indication, had gotten a lot more competitive. A lot of big companies have moved into the space, whereas in the cough space, everything had failed and the whole landscape had basically opened up. So we made the decision, you know what, we're just going to pivot and bear down and cough, and that's what we're going to be. And so I think along the way, one, you have to look at your data, but two, you've got to continue to look at the market conditions, sort of the landscape, and where do you have the best chance of getting to the patient, creating value. And you have to be willing to keep an open mind and also remember why you made certain decisions. Because a lot of times you make decisions based on a certain set of things at the time, but you learn a lot of stuff in the next 2 or 3 years. So that willingness to go back and say, you know what, we were here because of this, and that's now changed. So that flexibility and strategy, sort of offset by you can't keep changing your strategy every year or you never get anywhere. So it's sort of like a card you get to play a couple times, maybe as you build a company, but you do have to stay flexible and open-minded about.
How you're going to grow. And now, what was like some of the burden and impact, this chronic cough is having on patients? And why was it such a challenge to treat this condition?
Yeah. So we're in 2 types of cough, and we'll start with sort of our lead indication. One is called idiopathic pulmonary fibrosis, is the underlying disease. So it's typically in older people, 70s to 80s. It's a very ominous diagnosis to get. People typically live about 3 to 5 years. So it is terminal, sort of end of life. The number one complaint, and fibrosis is a fancy word for scarring, so it's progressive. So essentially your lungs get a certain amount of scarring that progresses. Eventually your lungs can't function at any level and you pass away from that. One of the things that comes out of that, about 85% of these patients have chronic cough. And what's happening is you have this scarring going on in your lungs, which is sending that signal up to the brain saying something's wrong. The brain stem can respond with a couple things, which are survival tactics. It can cough or it gasps for air. And it's why so many of these patients have this chronic cough. It has nothing to do with clearing their lungs because their lungs work fine. They're just getting scarred and fibrotic. And so there's this constant feedback loop of coughing. And so what happens to these patients who already have a terminal disease is they get very isolated. Lots of things trigger that cough reflex, walking, exercising, talking, temperature changes. And there's such a stigma now post-COVID with coughing that I hear from patients all the time is just embarrassing. Like I was just on a patient panel last week, and this woman had severe cough, who was young, by the way. She was like 35, she had IPF and this severe cough. She said she'll only go to the grocery store late at night, and she purposely looks down rows where nobody else is because she knows that she runs the risk of getting into these coughing fits. And people just shrink away from you. So they just all talked about the embarrassment, how they quit going out, they quit going to restaurants, they quit going to church. So I think from our perspective, this ability to take this tough condition, give people some semblance of a quality of life back. If you only have 3 to 5 years to live, you want to maximize that. There's also a belief that all this coughing, I mean, on average, these people are coughing sort of 700 to 1,000 times a day, mostly in the daytime. That is not good for lungs that are not healthy. It's creating a lot of inflammation. It's probably contributing to the fibrosis. So, just trying to create a better environment for the overall lungs is really where we're heading. The other condition is called refractory chronic cough, which is somewhat similar in that something in their background triggered coughing. That was either treated or went away, and then this cough sets in, and they basically have it the rest of their lives. These people cough. We had a guy in our trial that coughed 3,500 times a day, and he'd been coughing
Mm.
that way for 40 years. Those people all leave their jobs, they end up alone. So just trying to, and by the way, in that trial, our drug reduced his cough by 90% in 3 weeks. So, that's giving these people their lives back. And that's what I think drew Tom and I to it. It was, like I mentioned early on, it's just another version of pain, which is so crippling, except the difference of cough and pain is at least pain's a private experience. If you have back pain or knee pain, you can somewhat grin and bear it. When you're coughing 1,000 times a day, the whole world knows it. So anyway, that's what drew us into it. We could relate to it with our backgrounds and really trying to bring a quality of life back to these patients.
Yeah, because I've even had like a coughing fit, where you're just in a public place and it's just you can't stop. It's horrible.
And everyone looks at you. Yeah, these people talk about they break ribs. They actually get holes. It's called a pneumothorax in their lungs. They throw up, they vomit. I mean, it's really debilitating. Women get stress incontinence from it. So yeah, it's not just a nuisancey cough that some of us get. It's really debilitating for these people. And it's all they think about. I mean, all these patients told me the other day it consumes like 80% of their headspace because they're either trying not to cough or trying to get over cough. So we're just trying to bring an aspect to this disease that will, make their life better.
And now, how can you explain a little bit of how Haduvio works to address it? Like, what does it do to kind of stop that cough or give a little bit of, just a relief from it?
Yep. So, as I mentioned, this whole opioid biology in the body are important pathways for managing things like pain, like cough. And so, what's happening is this whole in your lungs, and you asked me another question I'll circle back on to why hasn't sort of anything else worked here? The other, and this will answer this question, everybody else had been looking at cough as a lung problem. So they were trying to treat cough through peripheral receptors in the lung or through an inhaled product that sat in the lung. And Tom, my co-founder, again, a neurologist by background, sort of saw the world through, the brain and the nervous system, kept saying, this isn't a lung problem, it's a brain problem. It's your brain recognizing something's wrong and it's firing off the signal. And so what's interesting about the way Haduvio works is it not only works on all those opioid receptors in the lung, it works all the way up the pathway to the brain. And so the drug works right along the pathway that's mediating this coughing and breathing. And that's why we think when you look at our data, we got incredible effect in almost in the first week it was measured. We had a statistically significant impact in almost everyone. So big effect, almost everyone worked very quickly. And I think it's because it's working right along the pathway where it needs to. It's not some off-target pathway. It's not a pathway that only affects certain types of cough. If you have neurological cough, it goes along this cough reflex arc, which is paved in opioid receptors. And that's why this drug is so helpful. So our trick was to get around all the baggage that came along with Schedule II opioids and try a different molecule that was an opioid receptor, but not a mu agonist. So that was sort of how the whole story tied together.
And you were going to kind of circle back. So, other things, why were they not addressing it or
Yeah, so
affecting?
because they were treating things only peripherally in the lung, they didn't do anything in the brain. So they would be on one peripheral receptor. So there's a P2X3 antagonist receptor that there was a lot of good theory of why that should work. And if your cough was triggered through the P2X3 receptor, that drug did indeed work. The problem is there's multiple receptors that can trigger cough. So if you weren't triggered through that one receptor, you didn't touch anything else. So everything else was struggling to get a big enough effect in enough people. And that's where Tom sort of said, not only does our drug work peripherally in the lung broadly, but it's going to catch everything going to the brain. So, I always use this phrase, all roads lead to Rome, but that's true. No matter where you get triggered in your cough, it's all going to end up at the brain stem. And so if your drug is working at the brain stem, you should be able to treat it. So that was sort of our aha moment, if you will, for the field. And I just came from a medical meeting, the American Cough Conference. Who knew that they have a whole meeting around that? And the whole discussion was around this neurological sort of contributions to cough, which had been speculated for a long time, but we finally had the data that said, yeah, this is right. This is where this is getting mediated from.
And I know, can you discuss, you had some recent positive top line results from the phase 2B Coral trial. Is that correct?
Yep. Yep. So that was in IPF, chronic cough. We saw amazing results. We studied 3 different doses against placebo, all 3 doses statistically separated. Importantly, we also saw a dose response. The low dose had, I think I'm going to pull this up here so I don't misquote them. The low dose had about a 48% response. The mid dose had about a 53% response. And by response, I mean a reduction in cough. And the high dose had a 60% reduction. So that's what's called in our business a dose response. That's important because you want to know that if you're taking more drug, that you're actually getting a bigger response. We also saw that this drug worked within 2 weeks. We did what's called a responder analysis. About 2/3 of these patients saw at least cut their cough in half in this 6-week time frame. And then we had multiple secondary endpoints that were patient-reported outcomes. So our primary endpoint was actually an objective cough monitor. But we also had the patient-reported outcomes, which, asked the patient, how often did you cough today or how severe was your cough today? And all of those were statistically significant as well. So just really, really compelling data, not only from an objective measurement, but also the patient could feel that response and separate from placebo as well.
Right. So they're seeing some, drastic changes in their lives, which is what the point is.
Yeah,
Um,
exactly.
and now why are these clinical trials, like what does this mean for the daily lives of these IPF patients who are suffering for this chronic cough? Like how is it going to impact their quality of life down the road?
Yeah, so the hope would be, that was phase 2B data. So we have to finish our phase 3 program. We're assuming we have to run 2 parallel trials, which will take us, probably about 18 months to 2 years beginning to end. To sort of enroll it all takes roughly a year, and then we'll need a year of safety data on top of that. From there, we'll be able to file with the FDA. So once this is approved, I think I keep referring back to this patient panel because it was so impactful to me. But these people are trying to live normal lives. They're trying to be out meeting friends, going to family gatherings, going to church, going to the store. This one woman still got children. She's trying to go to their school events. I think what it does is, they still have a terminal disease that they're navigating, but it's a progressive fibrotic disease that is largely in the background. They're dealing with it, but it's not so visible. What is visible is this horrible cough that's going on all the time. So I think what it hopefully allows them to do is live a more normal life, sort of for whatever amount of time. And there are drugs approved that are called antifibrotics, which slow down this disease progression. The problem is, and there's been some papers issued that instead of living 3 to 5 years, these people will live 5 to 7 years. The problem is it doesn't make them feel any better. They're still getting worse. They're just getting worse slower. So if you can slow down the disease progression and give them a quality of life back, a lot of these people are elderly anyway. Hopefully they can live out, a nice, good quality of life at the end. So it really struck me though, because I went through the timeline I just mentioned to you about, we got to run our pivotals and then you need FDA approval. And one guy said, "Well, I won't live to see the benefit, but hopefully my children do." I mean, it really like breaks your heart to hear that. You realize like a drug hopefully getting to market in 3 years, and they're already doing the calculus that they won't live to see the benefit, but they're still involved because they want to see this better as they move forward. So there is definitely an urgency around IPF that we're trying to move quickly and get this to market.
And that's kind of the next step. So what are the next steps for this? Like, what does the regulatory and clinical development pathway look like?
So the key next step for us is we need to go meet with the FDA. So we'll request what's called an end of phase 2 meeting. We'll go through all our data with them. We will lay out what we think our phase 3 program should look like, these 2 trials. Fortunately, we've been in discussions with the agency. There's a lot of things that are known. I think we're pretty comfortable with the primary endpoint, who the patients are, so there'll be some things. The biggest thing we'll probably negotiate is how big of a safety database do they want, because we don't need a lot of patients to show efficacy that the drug's effective, because it has such a big effect, and that's all sort of statistics. But you do want to get it in enough people in this patient group that you're confident there's sort of no safety signal here. So that's part of what we'll agree with the agency. How many people in this 1 year safety study do you want to see? So once we negotiate that out, hopefully we have that meeting later this year or first part of next year. Our team is already working in parallel to have those protocols written so that we can jump into trials pretty quickly and start enrolling. We'll basically run these 2 phase 3 studies, which will look pretty similar to the study we just reported out, with the exception of it'll be a little bit longer. That trial was a 6-week study. This will probably be a 12-week study for efficacy and then up to a year for safety. Otherwise, similar endpoints, similar patients, all that kind of stuff.
And this is probably just the starting point. So beyond IPF, how might these findings potentially pave the way for more treatments and new treatments for chronic cough and other conditions like that?
Yeah, so there's 2 other conditions we're going to focus on. And by the way, chronic cough, you're right, Melissa, is a problem in a lot of things. I mean, long COVID, people are dealing with chronic cough. I could name tons of conditions where people are like, "Have you thought about this? Have you thought about that?" The problem is we're a small company. It's expensive, all these indications. So I've told the world we're going to look at 3 things. We're going to do IPF cough. We're going to do what's called interstitial lung disease cough. IPF is part of this broad category called interstitial lung diseases. So that's basically this fibrosis in the connective lung tissue. IPF just happens to be the biggest bucket in these interstitial lung diseases. These other interstitial lung diseases, there's a basket of all kinds of things: lupus, RA, sarcoid. I mean, there's like 200 conditions. The FDA has allowed the antifibrotics to lump those all into one basket and run one trial to show that if you have fibrosis and you have cough, we should work the same as you did in IPF. So we'll do that piece of development as well. That essentially doubles the patient size that can get access to this. And then the third leg is that refractory chronic cough leg that I told you about, which we're just planning now for our phase 2B study to do around dosing. So those will be the 3 things. We'll stay home there. Those are all very big opportunities. We can create a lot of value, treat a lot of patients if we do just those 3 things.
And just change a lot of their quality of life. And, that's amazing. Definitely that even that percentage, like 60%, I mean, just to have that relief has got to be amazing to them.
Yeah, and I sort of wonder, it's interesting with cough because the experts, the pulmonologists will tell you that cough is fundamentally a hypersensitization disorder. So your brainstem gets hypersensitized. I mean, if you've ever had a long cough, you know how like the whole threshold of what triggers it really changes because you're sensitive. So, you breathe in something, perfume or temperature change, and it sends you into this coughing fit because you're hypersensitized. I mean, and that has to settle down over time. So it'll be interesting over time as we dose these drugs, if we're able to settle that down for people and it just gets better and better and the response gets better and stronger over time, particularly in the refractory chronic cough, because a lot of those people don't have an underlying disease. This cough got triggered long ago and the disease now is the cough. So there's a lot to learn about this, I think, if you can get an effective treatment and dose it in these patients long enough to see what happens.
And now, if listeners or people watching, if they want more information on Trevi, the company, or just what you're doing, what would be the best way to find that?
Probably to go on our website, trevitherapeutics.com. They also, if there's any patients listening to this and you're interested in clinical trials, you can go on clinicaltrials.gov and sort of watch for when we're doing our next trials. But always can send an email into the company if people want to get information around.
And that's nationally, on a national level, they can find these?
Yeah, I mean, so clintrials.gov is US only. There's also an equivalent in Europe as well. But yeah, coming to our website, you would always be able to find all of this. We have a patient information page there, so it'll have lots of good information there. And for any investors or people just interested in the company, there's all kinds of investor stuff on there as well.
Okay, perfect. Sounds great. Well, I really appreciate you joining us today. I learned a lot, and I think
Good.
hopefully a lot of other people did. And people who have these kind of conditions know that there's something that is on the horizon. So I'm sure they're excited too.
Yeah, and that they're not alone. There's a lot of people suffering. So thank you for having me, Melissa. It was nice to meet you.
Hi, thank you for joining us for another episode of the Business Roundup. If you haven't already, please subscribe or follow us on Instagram or YouTube. Also, feel free to leave comments below on topics you'd like us to cover. Until next time, I'm Melissa Bell.